I was standing in the director's office at Silver Oaks Retirement Community, staring at financial documents that proved residents were being systematically robbed, when Margaret Chen walked in and smiled at me, like I was a confused child who'd wandered into the wrong room. "Mrs. Patterson, what are you doing in here?" Her voice dripped with concern, but her eyes were calculating, cold. I'd seen that look before on my daughter-in-law's face right before she tried to convince everyone I had dementia. The documents in my hands showed everything. Forged power of attorney forms. Bank accounts drained. Properties sold without consent. 23 residents over the past 4 years. All of them now conveniently moved to the locked memory care wing or dead. But let me back up, because you need to understand how I ended up in this nightmare in the first place. 3 months earlier, my son David had surprised me with a tour of Silver Oaks. After my husband died and I'd been rattling around alone in our 4-bedroom house in the suburbs for 2 years, David thought it was time for me to be around people my own age. The place looked like a resort. Marble lobby, crystal chandeliers, a dining room that could have been in a Michelin star restaurant. The monthly fee was steep at $4,500. But David assured me my savings and Social Security could handle it, and he'd help with the rest. I'd been a high school English teacher for 37 years, and my husband had been an accountant, so we'd saved well. We had nearly $400,000 in retirement accounts plus the house, which was worth about $350,000. I felt secure. I felt like I could afford a nice place for my final chapter. Margaret gave us the tour herself, showing off the fitness center, the art studio, the movie theater. She introduced me to residents who gushed about how happy they were. A woman named Dorothy grabbed my hand and told me it was the best decision she'd ever made. Another resident, Bill, said his only regret was not moving in sooner. I signed the contract that afternoon, sold my house within 6 weeks, and moved into apartment 412 on the 4th floor, with a view of the courtyard gardens. The first month was exactly what they'd promised. I took watercolor classes, joined the book club, made friends with my neighbors. Dorothy lived 2 doors down and we'd have coffee every morning. Bill was across the hall and always had a joke ready. I started to think David had been right, that this was exactly what I needed. Then Dorothy missed our coffee date. When I knocked on her door, a staff member I didn't recognize told me Dorothy had been moved to memory care. I was confused because Dorothy had been sharp as a tack just the day before. Could quote entire passages from the novels we were reading. Sometimes it happens suddenly, the staff member said, already walking away. I tried to visit Dorothy in memory care, but they told me only family members were allowed. I asked her daughter's number from the front desk, but they said they couldn't give out personal information. When I persisted, Margaret herself came to speak with me, putting her hand on my arm and suggesting that perhaps I was having trouble adjusting to the transition. "It's common for new residents to experience anxiety," she said. "We have an excellent therapist on staff if you'd like to talk to someone." I wasn't anxious. I was concerned about my friend. But something in Margaret's tone made me back off. Made me feel like I was being dramatic. 2 weeks later, Bill disappeared too. Same story, sudden decline, moved to memory care. But I'd played chess with Bill the night before, and he'd beaten me handily while discussing current events and complaining about his daughter never calling. I started paying attention, watching, listening. At dinner, I'd catch fragments of conversations from other residents. Whispered worries about friends who'd vanished, about strange charges on their accounts, about staff members asking them to sign papers they didn't understand. I befriended a woman named Patricia who'd been there for 3 years. Over lunch one day, she told me about her friend Ruth. who'd been moved to memory care 6 months ago despite being perfectly lucid. Ruth's daughter had come to visit and found her mother over-medicated, barely conscious. When the daughter complained, she was told Ruth had become violent and the medication was necessary. The daughter tried to move Ruth out, but Margaret produced documents showing Ruth had signed over power of attorney to the facility. The daughter got a lawyer, Patricia whispered. But before anything could happen, Ruth died. Heart attack, they said. She was cremated within 48 hours. Something cold settled in my stomach. I asked Patricia why she hadn't gone to the police. She looked at me like I was naive. Ruth's daughter did. They investigated and found nothing wrong. Margaret has lawyers, connections. The police saw a grieving daughter trying to blame someone for her mother's death. I couldn't let it go. I started documenting everything. I kept a journal of which residents disappeared and when. I made friends with the cleaning staff, who spoke limited English and were afraid of losing their jobs. One of them, Maria, told me she'd seen Margaret taking jewelry from residents' apartments, claiming the residents had given permission to sell items to cover expenses. I needed proof, real evidence that couldn't be dismissed. So I started volunteering to help in the main office, filing papers, organizing events. Margaret seemed pleased that I was so engaged, so willing to be useful. She had no idea I was photographing documents with my phone whenever she stepped out. That's how I discovered the pattern. Residents would sign a standard agreement when they moved in. Buried in the fine print was language about the facility being able to assume financial guardianship if a resident was deemed incapacitated by the staff physician, Dr. Leonard, who was on Margaret's payroll. Once they had guardianship, they'd systematically drain accounts, sell properties, and when the money ran out, the resident would die within months. Heart attack, stroke, complications from a fall. I had photographs of 23 cases over 4 years. I had bank statements showing accounts emptied. I had property records showing houses sold for below market value to companies that traced back to Margaret's family members. I thought I had enough. I went to the police. The detective who took my statement was polite but skeptical. He looked at my printed documents, listened to my explanation, and then asked how old I was and how long I'd been living at Silver Oaks. "Ma'am, these are serious allegations," he said. "But what I'm seeing here looks like standard estate management for residents who can no longer handle their own affairs." I tried to explain about Dorothy and Bill, about residents who were fine one day and supposedly incompetent the next. He nodded patiently and suggested that perhaps I wasn't aware of their actual conditions. That sometimes people hid their decline from friends. "I think you should talk to your family," he said, sliding my documents back across his desk. "Sometimes when we get older, we can become confused about what we're seeing." I left the police station shaking with anger and frustration. They thought I was a paranoid old woman, seeing conspiracies where there were none. I tried a lawyer next, found one who specialized in elder law. He reviewed my documents and agreed it looked suspicious, but explained that without testimony from the victims or their families, it would be nearly impossible to prove. Most of the families didn't even know what had happened, because Margaret was careful to target residents who were isolated, whose children lived far away or visited infrequently. "These cases are incredibly difficult to prosecute," he said, "even if we had more evidence. The facility has deep pockets and expensive lawyers. I'm sorry, but I don't think I can help you." I tried calling the Adult Protective Services hotline. They opened an investigation, but it went nowhere because when they interviewed Margaret, she produced glowing testimonials from families, documentation from Dr. Leonard about residents' declining health, and perfectly organized financial records that made everything look legitimate. The investigator called me and said, They'd found no evidence of abuse or exploitation. She suggested gently that moving to a retirement community could be stressful, and sometimes caused elderly residents to become suspicious of staff. No one would listen. No one would believe me. And then things got worse. My son David called me, concerned because Margaret had reached out to him. She'd told him I was displaying signs of paranoia, making wild accusations against staff, disturbing other residents with conspiracy theories. She'd suggested I might need a psychological evaluation. "Mom, are you okay?" David asked. "Margaret said you've been acting strange, talking about people being murdered." I tried to explain what I'd found, but David cut me off. He reminded me that I'd been depressed after Dad died, that maybe the stress of the move had been too much. He suggested I see the facility's therapist. I felt the walls closing in. They were doing to me exactly what they'd done to Dorothy, and Bill and all the others. They were painting me as unstable, setting the stage to declare me incompetent. I refused to see the therapist, which Margaret documented as non-compliance with care recommendations. I stopped going to group activities, because I knew anything I said would be used against me. My isolation was documented as social withdrawal, a sign of depression. David came to visit with his wife, Stephanie. They sat me down in my apartment and talked to me like I was a child. Stephanie had never liked me, had always thought I was too critical, too involved in their lives. Now she saw an opportunity. "Maybe it's time to consider memory care," she said, glancing at David. "Just temporarily, until you're feeling more stable." I realized then that they'd already talked to Margaret, that the plan was already in motion. If I went into memory care, even temporarily, they'd sedate me, get me to sign documents, and drain my accounts. Just like they'd done to all the others. I refused. I told David and Stephanie to leave. David looked hurt and Stephanie looked satisfied, like I'd just proven her point. 2 days later, Margaret appeared at my door with Dr. Leonard. They said they needed to do a wellness check based on concerns from my family. I refused to let them in. Dr. Leonard called through the door that if I didn't cooperate, they'd have to assume I was a danger to myself and call for an emergency psychiatric evaluation. I was trapped. If I let them in, Dr. Leonard would declare me incompetent. If I didn't, they'd have me forcibly removed. I called David, begging him to help me. But Stephanie answered his phone and told me coldly that they were doing this for my own good. I felt like I was drowning. Everything I'd worked for, my independence, my dignity, my savings, it was all about to be stripped away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. That night, I sat in my apartment, thinking about Ruth, about Dorothy and Bill, about all the others who'd ended up over-medicated and helpless in memory care before dying convenient deaths. I thought about giving up, about just accepting what was coming. But then I got angry. Really angry. These people had stolen from dozens of elderly residents, had probably killed some of them, and they were getting away with it because no one takes old people seriously. I wasn't going down without a fight. If official channels wouldn't help me, I'd have to help myself. I started by reaching out to families of former residents, the ones who'd died under suspicious circumstances. I found obituaries online, tracked down children and siblings. I called them and asked careful questions about their loved ones' final months, about whether anything had seemed off about their finances or medical care. 3 families admitted they'd had suspicions but hadn't known what to do. One daughter said her father's entire estate had been gone by the time he died. But the facility had documentation showing he'd signed everything over for his care. She'd felt guilty for not visiting more, for not catching it sooner. I asked if they'd be willing to talk to a lawyer, to go public with their stories. They were scared. Margaret had threatened one family with a lawsuit for defamation. when they'd questioned the care. But I kept pushing, kept explaining that together, we might have enough to force a real investigation. Meanwhile, I needed more evidence. I couldn't access the office anymore because Margaret had banned me from volunteering, claiming my behavior was disruptive. But I remembered that Maria, the cleaning woman, had a key to every room in the facility. I found Maria during her evening shift and offered her $500 cash to let me into Margaret's office after hours. She was terrified, but she needed the money. She had 3 kids and was sending money back to family in Honduras. We went in at midnight when the overnight staff was minimal. I had an hour while Maria kept watch. I photographed everything I could find, focusing on financial records, medical files, correspondence with families. I found emails discussing which residents had substantial assets, and no close family nearby, flagged as priority targets. I found Drive, Leonard's actual notes, unedited, showing residents were mentally competent before he'd filed official reports declaring them incapacitated. I found a spreadsheet tracking how much had been extracted from each resident before they were moved to memory care. I hit the jackpot when I found Margaret's personal laptop, left in her desk drawer. She'd been arrogant enough to leave it unlocked, probably assuming no one would ever dare come into her office. I forwarded myself entire folders of documents, including communications with a lawyer about how to structure the scam to minimize legal risk. I had everything, undeniable proof, but I knew if I just handed it to the police again, Margaret would claim I'd fabricated it or stolen it illegally and they'd dismiss it. I needed to make this public in a way that couldn't be buried. I needed media attention, public outrage, pressure that would force authorities to act. I reached out to a local investigative reporter named Jennifer Walsh, who'd done a series on nursing home fraud. I sent her everything I had, along with contact information for the 3 families who'd agreed to speak. Jennifer was interested but cautious. She needed to verify everything independently. She spent 3 weeks investigating, interviewing families, hiring a forensic accountant to review the financial records I'd provided. She contacted former employees who'd left Silver Oaks, finding 2 who were willing to speak on record about suspicious practices they'd witnessed. During those 3 weeks, I lived in constant fear that Margaret would make her move, that David and Stephanie would show up with papers to have me committed. I stopped answering David's calls. I had my groceries delivered. I barely left my apartment except to meet with Jennifer in parking lots and coffee shops far from Silver Oaks. Then the story broke. Jennifer's newspaper ran it as a front page feature with a follow-up investigative series. The headline was, "Luxury Retirement Community Accused of Systematic Elder Abuse." It detailed everything: the fake diagnoses, the financial exploitation, the suspicious deaths, all backed by the documents I'd provided, and testimony from families. The response was immediate and explosive. Within 24 hours, the State Attorney General's office announced an investigation. Adult Protective Services reopened cases they'd previously closed. The police showed up with warrants. Margaret was arrested at her home. Dr. Leonard was arrested at his office. 3 other staff members were taken into custody. The facility was placed under state supervision. David called me, his voice shaking. He'd seen the news. He couldn't believe what had been happening right under his nose, couldn't believe he'd almost helped them. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, and he was crying. "I should have listened to you. I should have believed you." Stephanie got on the phone and apologized too, though she sounded more shocked than remorseful. She admitted she'd thought I was being difficult, that she'd been too quick to assume I was declining. The investigation uncovered even more than I'd found. Margaret had been running similar schemes at 2 other facilities she owned. Over 7 years, she'd stolen An estimated $12 million from elderly residents. Dr. Leonard had falsified hundreds of medical evaluations. 4 deaths were ruled suspicious and remained under investigation. Margaret was charged with elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and potentially involuntary manslaughter. She was denied bail because the judge considered her a flight risk. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd simply been managing residents' finances with their consent. But the evidence was overwhelming. The trial took 8 months. I testified, along with Maria and the other families. The jury deliberated for 2 days before finding Margaret guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Dr. Leonard got 15 years. The other staff members took plea deals in exchange for testimony. Silver Oaks was shut down permanently. The state helped relocate all the residents to other facilities. I moved into a small apartment in a building where I could live independently, near David and my grandchildren. Several families sued the facility's parent company and won settlements that returned some of what had been stolen. I got back most of my money that Margaret had been positioning to steal, plus damages. But the real victory wasn't the money or the convictions. It was knowing that I'd stopped them, that no more elderly people would be drugged and robbed and left to die while everyone looked the other way. I'm 63 years old. And I learned something important through all of this. They count on us being invisible, on people assuming we're confused or paranoid when we speak up. They count on our own children doubting us, on authorities dismissing us as just another complaining senior. But I'm not invisible, and I'm not confused. And I'll never stop fighting.